Okay, everybody, we'll make a start. I know some people are still coming in, but mindful of the half 1 starting time. So first of all, hello, good afternoon, and welcome. This is the second of Red Loft's Bitesize Broadcast series, where we examine kind of key hot topics in the sector. Our focus today is on a very pertinent question: to retrofit or to redevelop, considering options and making the best use of assets. My name is Tom Conlon. I'm a development director for Red Loft. I've been at Red Loft for 5 years. Previously had experience in the RP and development sector, and we're delighted today to be joined by Jeremy Graham, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Bugler, and with 37 years experience in the industry. I think that qualifies as vast experience, Jeremy.
I think it probably does, Tom. Yes.
Jeremy brings a kind of contractor developer perspective on this key question. And also delighted to be joined by our very own Barbara Nemeth, who's our Head of Research Consultancy. Yeah. So welcome, Barbara and Jeremy.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
We're going to cover four key areas. I will just stress the sort of bite-sized nature of this broadcast, and that the breadth and depth of this topic could be absolutely vast. But we will try to cover some current considerations that are influencing this decision making as to whether to retrofit or redevelop, competing priorities when putting together options appraisals, look at some of the practical challenges drawn upon case studies for both refurbishment and redevelopment, and also considering delivery options, what works best for clients. I will say as well, we won't be able to cover absolutely everything. If you do have questions, please pop them into the chat and we will respond to them either kind of during or at the end of the presentation. Also, if you can't quite see us on your screen, do left click and fit to screen and you should see all three of us. All right, I am just, before we dive in, I am contractually obliged just to quickly mention a little bit about Red Loft. We are a housing consultancy with our roots very much in the affordable housing sector. We've been supporting clients in primarily public and housing association sectors for over 20 years, with some private sector clients as well. And we support clients throughout the development process, end-to-end service. We help with all or any of the rebate stages, and also support sales and marketing functions, and are doing more and more with asset management teams as well. There's a list of a summary of some of the clients there. Okay, so delving into this topic, first thing just wanted to cover is why are we talking about this now? And there's a number of key themes that really come together as to why is this such a pertinent question, and the starting point probably is demonstrated through the pie chart there, which shows as a percentage of UK greenhouse gas emissions, residential buildings, and I will stress residential is our focus today, is one of the key contributors to UK emissions. Transport leads away, but residential not far behind. And in that context, if as a country we're going to be achieving some of the regulatory targets that are being set, particularly net zero by 2050, then it's clear that an awful lot of investment, an awful lot of interventions will be needed in the residential stock. In addition, there has been some regulatory pushes around getting EPC, getting all housing stock EPC up to a minimum of level C. There was a requirement which has since slightly been watered down to a target by 2035. That may well become more stringent and more of a requirement in the event of a change of government. And alongside those regulatory pressures, a number of local authorities in particular have see this as a key political issue. So a climate emergency has been declared by a great number of local authorities, and a number are also seeking to improve upon that net zero 2050 target and have their own targets. So, for example, Cambridge City Council, who I'm working with at the moment, for 2030 net zero targets. So that's one area of the question around sustainability. But another reason for the pertinence now is probably building safety, and that, as we're all aware in the sector, there's been, and rightly so, a huge push on taking building safety, implementing building safety measures, and I'll include damp and mould within that building safety context. Ensuring homes are safe has to be a priority, and again, that's a factor as to why we're considering this issue now. And alongside those perhaps more recent developments, we can't forget the good traditional asset management practice that has been going on for some time. Best practice stockholding organisations will be undertaking stock condition surveys, and that will enable active asset management in their stock. That will hopefully be helping associations and authorities to identify where stock might be underperforming for some reason. That could be higher repairs and maintenance costs, that could be high void rates and identifying hard to let properties. It could be identifying areas where there's a high prevalence of antisocial behaviour and understanding reasons behind that. But I think the key point to make on that is, with the benefit of good asset management and good stock condition surveys, it helps inform the knowledge to lead to decision making based on strong data. Across all of these, the key point to make is that for a huge amount of stock, do nothing is no longer an option. Just moving on to beyond the background. So for your individual project, and a project can range from a single unit all the way through to an estate regeneration, it's important to consider what's the right intervention for you. Is it to redevelop? Is it to retrofit? Is it a mix of both? And to consider this, you really need to be clear, and my advice or our advice would be, you really need to be clear in establishing what your priorities are. These could be those sustainability measures and hitting those political targets I mentioned previously. It could be ensuring compliance. It could be ensuring a financial return, and that is absolutely still valid. For a lot of organisations, redevelopment offers an opportunity to deliver a surplus which can be reinvested in affordable housing elsewhere. So we shouldn't shy away from the fact that delivering a strong financial return is a really valid reason for redevelopment. Within the right lever focus on existing stock, we can't forget as well that there is huge opportunity there's still a housing crisis, and there's a real need to increase housing numbers. If redevelopment presents that opportunity, that for some organisations will be a key consideration as well. We'll hear from Barbara a bit later on some of the delivery risks, and one of other area to consider in determining the priorities for your project is, could this represent a learning opportunity? A number of associations and local authorities have developed some really innovative retrofit projects and case studies which examine typologies and different interventions, and that's really building up that organisational knowledge for what will work best across the wider stock. So there was one real recommendation from at this options appraisal stage. It's been really clear from the outset what your particular critical success factors are, and that will facilitate informed decision making. And the more aligned those critical success factors are with your organisational strategy, that in turn will help you with those political and organisational buy-in to deliver that project. I'll touch briefly on a couple of the measures within this wider question, one being financial position and a second to come on sustainability. I think firstly, as the title suggests, of course, it's financial position as opposed to financial viability, because it's really important that we recognise that not all interventions will necessarily make a return, and that's fine, but we need to do so with our eyes open. I think, as the image suggests, in the housing world, and that's not just the kind of housing association or local authority world. So it works for developers. The quality of data can be sometimes variable, and I think that image is probably something we're all familiar with in the sector of questioning some of the data. But I think that presents a real opportunity to ensure that we'll, with our internal teams, making sure we know the baseline. We should all know, as stockholding organisations, we should know what rents properties bring in. We should have a good idea of management and maintenance costs. And if we do, that should enable us to develop a current stock MPV. So that's one of the areas. If you don't have that data, I'll encourage you to be kind of challenging your internal teams and colleagues to ensure you've got that baseline position, because that will really facilitate the pros and cons of different interventions and options. One other point I'll just touch on quickly, and particularly for those of you sort of like myself coming from a development background, VAT often gets forgotten about. I think when you're used to working on new build projects, VAT is 0 rated, and it kind of slips out your mind that don't need to worry about VAT, doesn't hit your appraisal, we can forget about that. And then suddenly you come and look at a refurbishment or retrofit project, and all of a sudden you've got 20% on in addition to the bill costs that you do need to consider. So just a reminder really to make sure when you're doing those appraisals to consider that VAT impact, and it's especially the case for housing associations. I know amongst the people tuning in today, there's a number of local authority clients, and for reasons I've never fully understood, it's a world of mystery, but I don't think VAT hits local authorities in the same way it does housing associations. But nonetheless, just to be clear, that's been checked. One particular area that we'd love to find as a bit of a bugbear in our sector is the often lack of consideration of life cycle costs. I think as a sector, as development, asset management professionals, perhaps an area we haven't been as persuasive as we might is in convincing our colleagues in finance that life cycle costs are just as important as capital costs. And if you really want to understand the project's pros and cons from an appraisal perspective, it's important to consider costs across the life cycle. If you're putting an intervention in which leads to maintenance and repairs obligations being reduced over time, why aren't you capturing it? Why are we still relying on the standard assumptions, which doesn't recognise the benefits of those interventions? Other point to just flag is the opportunity to maximise grant. Again, from a redevelopment perspective, I'm sure many of us will be familiar with various affordable homes programmes, but there is currently, and this is hot off the press as Monday this week, wave 3 of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has been launched, or the guidance note has been launched, with applications opening this summer. Some of you, no doubt, will have had experience of waves 1 and 2, but if you're not aware of it, I would encourage you to look at that and understand if this is something that can help your project. It's aimed at local authorities, RPs, charities, and is eligible for all homes under with an EPC of under C. Works must be completed by March 28. And then the last point I was going to just draw upon before handing over to Jeremy was on sustainability and assessing sustainability in a similar way as we just talked about assessing the financial position. Again, it's easy to forget about embodied carbon. It's really clear that needs to be considered and assessed during options appraisals. And really, from a logical perspective, we get encouraged to reduce, to reuse, to recycle. So logically, reusing the building structure reduces carbon output. However, it doesn't always hold true. So some colleagues on the call from Cambridge might recognise this estate. It was being considered, or options were being considered you can probably identify some of the challenges. It's on the left-hand image. There's been lack of permeability on the estate. There were various places where the design perhaps facilitated dark corners and antisocial behaviour. They had various building safety issues. So a lot in the mix with this estate. But what I've probably found most fascinating with this is that while, let's say, the logical thought would be retaining the structure would be the most sustainable option, in this case, with the help of a specialist firm, we assessed the various options across 30 years. And this graph, the orange, shows effectively the carbon impact of the works, but the total over lifetime building energy, you can see from that the essential repairs option, minimal retrofit interventions, that was the most costly from a carbon perspective. The retrofit option, the second option there, sustainable refurbishment, there was some impact from the works and a big reduction against the baseline, but nonetheless, over 30 years, actually, in this case, redevelopment was the more sustainable option. And there's many reasons for that. I mean, one I just mentioned briefly, you can do a certain amount with retrofit, but you can't reorientate the building. And that's one example of where actually sometimes starting again might be the optimal approach. So a few considerations there from me. I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to talk about some of the practical considerations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that, Tom. So this is from a contractor's point of view, but also with one eye possibly on the development as a whole point of view and key considerations for the whole team. So the first one, the need to know and characterise the site. So this is understanding the scheme that you're potentially looking at. So this is getting to know your site. So it's about surveys, it's understanding if you're to refurbish, so for instance, the form of structure. So for instance, whether it's timber frame, whether it's traditional build concrete frame, understand some of the constraints that those forms of construction can bring in terms of the potential to refurbish. You can also look at, in terms of other constraints, whether buildings that you're looking to knock down. So for instance, listed buildings, it's not impossible to demolish listed buildings, but they are far more challenging in order to gain a planning consent. Also within a conservation area, trees are automatically protected. So there's notifications required, so on to tree officers required. And there's more constraints than areas that aren't protected either under the listing or as a conservation area. And then in terms of sort of the least onerous, in terms of knowing your site, in terms of listings, is locally listed. So that's where you have a building of architectural importance, but it doesn't fulfill all of the criteria in order to become listed. So the next one, the buildings of architectural importance, this is in terms of a building that wouldn't be, say, for instance, listed or potentially within a conservation area, but is well known within the area and is held in very, very high regard. So if you're proposing to potentially knock that building down, one of the key considerations will be objections, a number of objections to a planning application for new build, also in terms of reputational effect, and it's having everything as a balance when we look at whether we refurb or whether we go for a new build. But I always think we need to respect good architecture from the past, and that to me is very much a key consideration. Moving on from there, just in terms of the properties, if we're to look at a refurbishment option, can they be refurbished effectively? A very good scheme, a very good design architect, very good engineer can often come up with a fairly effective refurbishment scheme. But if you're dealing with and we'll come to this in a couple of slides time, if you're dealing with a very poorly constructed scheme in the first place, you will often look at a scheme and say you've got very, very little to start with in terms of a good starting point. So you'll end up with a scheme that you're not necessarily proud of or pleased with, and therefore the default to me would always be to knock that down and go for a new build option. So basically start with a clean slate. Other considerations when you're looking at regeneration work and also refurbishment. So if you're going for refurbishment work where you're going to move residents or owners out, you have to look at compulsory purchase, whether you're going for a new build and the effect that will have both time-wise and financially. And it's also the issue of what we call hidden households. This is where within a household you have parents and you have also children that are over 18. So if you're to rehouse those people, you aren't rehousing one household, you can end up rehousing 2 or 3 households because people of 18 or over have housing rights when it comes to being relocated. So it's just another consideration. A big one in terms of big consideration is residents, neighbours, adjoining businesses. So we'd look again at refurbishment. We know if you're to stay with the foundations and the actual structure as it's standing at the moment, or you compare that with new build, you're going to have far fewer lorry movements. In theory, you should have a shorter construction period, depending upon what it is ultimately you're seeking to do. And the impact upon residents, neighbours and adjoining businesses can be far less intrusive when carrying out refurbishment work when compared with new build work. So that's a big plus from a refurbishment project point of view. Another consideration for decanting, if you're doing unoccupied refurbishment or new build work with a knockdown, is where you're going to put your residents. So this might be, if you're considering a large scale regeneration, you might end up phasing it, which is quite often the approach. So if you had, say, 500 properties, you wouldn't knock all 500 down in one go. You'd look maybe to split that into bite-sized chunks to try and reduce the impact. So you might move 50 families off, produce 40, 50, 60 new properties, bring people back, and then move on to the next phase. So it's a very important part of considering whether you go for refurbishment or new build. And then the last point, political will and support. So quite often we see schemes that are proposed and there is an awful lot of objections within the area, both from residents, businesses, from ward councillors and so on to the scheme. And you have to say it after you understand your site, you characterise your site, you get to know your site, you then produce a stage 1 RBA stage 1 scheme, again, whether it's refurbishment or new build, and it's then to test the feeling within the area to see whether you've got political will and support, you've got support of adjoining residents, neighbours and owners through consultation. If there is a lot of objections, you may make the decision at that point to have a rethink in terms of your approach and the scheme that you're considering. So this is 2 extreme case studies we'll do now. So this was the scheme that I was involved with for the best part of 6 years. This is a timber frame scheme built in the early 1970s. It was a quick solution at the time. It's timber framed. This addressed a lot of housing shortage within Brent as the local authority. But if you look at this as an example of, would you consider refurbishment or would you look at knockdown and new build? I would suggest the answer is quite straightforward, and that is I would knock these down and re-provide, which is exactly what happened. So thermally, these were performing really, really poorly. There's a lot of asbestos within the properties. They're really poorly built. There's a lot of mould, a lot of damp, a lot of social issues on the estate and so on. And this led to the conclusion very quickly to re-provide. So this is a snapshot of the estate afterwards on the left there. So this is a 4-storey block of flats put back. These thermally were very high performing at the time. So they had U values around 0.2 on the external walls, 0.2 on the roofs, 0.15 on the floors, built to meet secure by design standards, a lot of external lighting, a lot of security features. It meant that people who were moved off from the old resi-form estate and moved back came back into much more warm and comfortable and secure environments. And the feedback from the residents in terms of this regeneration was that the scheme was a wholesale success. So this to me is a scheme that has worked really well and an example of a well considered, well thought through scheme. However, to the right, there is a picture here of a road called Crome Road at the top of the estate. And there's some nice trees there, which have matured well in the last 20 years, screening from the railway line. However, on the grass verge, on the original estate regeneration, it showed a terrace of houses being built on that grass verge. And what was failed to understand when the master planning was done, and this goes back to characterising your site, is that there are two 33,000 volt electric cables running through there, which we actually found almost by accident when carrying out trial holes. So we sought budget quotations to move those two cables from London Electric as it was at the time. And the budget that came back was £2 million and around a year's lead-in, which would have affected the programme wholesale in terms of cost and time-wise. So this is an example of where if you do your investigations really well at the outset, it paints you a picture, and then that leads to good, well-informed decisions being made in terms of the re-provision. So statutory approvals, these might be considered quite boring, but obviously they are statutory and therefore they are essential. So a lot of these would lead you in terms of the route of least resistance would lead you towards a refurbishment scheme. So if you looked at planning, refurbishment schemes are often considered to be far more easy or simple to secure a planning consent. Statutory authorities, often you can have the suppliers obviously exist. If you've got good, well thought through, clever design, you can leave the stat authorities where they are. Whereas if you look at a new build scheme, quite often we're having to relocate substations at considerable time and expense. We're having to relocate mains, again, considerable time and expense. Whereas refurbishment, if you leave what's there and can work and design around, again, that is effectively good use of money, good use of our money and public money. Diverting mains doesn't actually contribute anything to the end product. Environment Agency, key consideration for schemes, again, refurbishment. Environment Agency is generally less interested, particularly as a stakeholder when a planning application is being made in terms of refurbishment work when compared to new build. Building regs, again, generally the rule of thumb is as long as you're not making the situation worse with a refurbishment scheme compared with the existing, it will, as a rule of thumb, you'll get through your building regulations, whereas obviously new build regulations are now very onerous and becoming more onerous year on year. With that comes cost implications, cost and time implications. So again, that's a key consideration. And warranty provider, same set of parameters applied to the building regulations. Another added layer with the warranty provider though is if you are looking to refurbish a listed building, quite often they are looking to bring the refurbishment up to new build standards. And then you have a conservation officer who is trying to preserve the structure as it is. And there is quite often a tension between those two. And that is a very difficult solution to navigate and resolve. So this is a scheme that we did back in 2016 and 17. So the top left, this is an old site, vastly underdeveloped. Behind this block, there was a scheme put together of 55 new build houses, partly for sale, part NHS accommodation, and to refurbish this block, which was locally listed, and turn it into 10 apartments for sale. So the bottom left is the finished product. And again, this shows a good, well-planned, well-considered scheme. Structure's hardly been touched, hardly altered at all. So again, from a cost point of view and a time point of view, it's very efficient, but you end up with a product to me that looks superb, and they sold really well. They achieved good sales per square foot. So this is where good architecture and good consultants are absolutely essential for any project. And also the client, I felt, gave a very, very good brief with the scheme, which helped help the team in terms of planning and actual delivery. So it's a really, really good looking scheme, one which a lot of people are very proud of. So just second last slide. So sustainability. So the question we talk about at the moment, the existing stock. So Tom talked about stock surveys earlier. Understanding the buildings that are there in terms of refurbishment. Can they be suitably converted? Can you achieve something that is going to perform to your level, not just the building regulations or the warranty providers, but to your level? So perhaps if you're an RP or a local authority, can you produce a scheme that meets your standards? So if not, and that's your key driver, then by default, your conclusion will be to knock it down and rebuild. Again, key point at the moment has been for a long time now, fuel poverty and running costs. So new builds, typically at the moment, new builds, say for RPs and local authorities, external walls now 0.13 or 0.15, your floors 0.1, your roofs 0.11, your windows generally down at 1 or 1.2. So you've got a very, very good thermally efficient product with a new build. You compare that with a refurbishment you might achieve maybe on your walls with insulated render, insulated plasterboard, 0.2, 0.22 as a U value in the walls. So there's considerable difference there. And again, that's all part of the picture. This goes back to everything being a balance. It's all part of the picture that has to be painted. Pride in the area, talk about sustainability. So it's whether people want to live in the area, they'll take pride in the area, they'll look after the product, again, whether refurbed or new build. So again, key consideration. And your carbon footprint, both producing the scheme and the actual end product, the running costs. So your graph earlier was actually very, very interesting in terms of the way that works, new build against refurb, because a refurb, I would have said, would be more efficient, balancing everything.
Yeah, and it is not the same for each project.
No,
but you have to look at each.
as a guide,
yeah,
that is actually very revealing.
Yeah.
I thought so. Yeah. And then just as a final thought, final overriding thought is, does the scheme work? Does it work financially? Is it a compromise? And I always think a yardstick before we put any design through, for instance, stage 2 onwards, is can we look into the future and look at the completed scheme and say that scheme has fulfilled most or all of our criteria, or has it been a compromise? Has it done its job? Will we think it's average? Will it be a disappointment? And I think if it's average or a disappointment, I would stop the bus and literally have a rethink, because all projects I fundamentally believe we should be proud of once they're completed. All right.
That's it. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you to Barbara. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, that was a very insightful and thorough list, but I'm sure that if we had more time, there would be more consideration.
Yes, yes.
We could be sitting here for hours. So kind of moving on to the next step in considering your project, whether it's retrofit or redevelop, or perhaps alongside all these site-specific considerations, what you also need to consider is how you're going to deliver that scheme. So we're going to look at the main delivery routes, which are direct delivery, joint venture, and development agreements. Now, obviously, all of these have their own nuances, and the next couple of minutes will be a very simplified version of all of them. But looking at them one by one, direct delivery, kind of in a simplified version, is when landowner is also the developer. One entity therefore bears all the costs of the development, but also benefits from all of the profits made and all the decisions over the site. So the biggest advantage is that you have full control over what you're designing, what you're developing. Whereas the downside, I guess, is that it's very resource intensive, not just financially, but also in terms of human resources. And you need to have all your delivery expertise either in-house or procure a skilled team for the job, including contractors and your full consultant team to lead you on the project. There's some cases where you might not have all of the three options. Obviously, for example, for a straightforward retrofit project, you're most likely to go with direct delivery, because if you don't have any scope to increase the number of units, you won't have any incentive for another party to bear some of the costs or all of the costs of your development. Moving on to joint venture, it's a commercial partnership between two or potentially more parties that is formed for the sole purpose of delivering a project, or in some cases, a whole portfolio of projects. And it can be set up in many different ways, and it will be, in any case, based on the risk-sharing scenario that both parties or all parties are comfortable with. Most commonly in the housing sector, what we see is that it's a 50-50 joint venture. If we're talking about, for example, the partnership of a registered provider and a private developer, but it can come in many different forms. And by 50-50, what I mean is that 50% of the cost is borne by one party, as well as the profits are shared 50-50 as well. And therefore, all the risks are also 50-50. But it does not require necessarily a like-for-like injection of capital at all stages of development. So what we often see is that one party might provide the land or even bear the cost, the upfront cost in terms of planning of the development. And then the other party might meet those costs by drawing down more funds during the construction period. JVs can easily become quite complicated, so it's good practice, and it should be made clear from the very onset what the priorities and requirements of each party are and what roles they take in the delivery of the project, especially because there are multiple parties to satisfy, and if there's a board sitting on top of the special purpose vehicle created for that purpose, then it needs to be equally represented by both parties to ensure that collaboration is maximized. And all the approval processes should be made clear from the very onset, so that later on any conflicts are avoided. The third category that we listed there is our development agreements. Now, again, this is a very broad umbrella term that entails a lot of different agreements. But essentially, this is where the landowner would enter into a contract with the developer for the delivery of the scheme, and therefore the costs and revenues are not shared equally. They're mostly transferred along with the risk to a developer party. But the key difference between kind of just being a land sale agreement and then the developer going off and delivering whatever they want on the site is that the landowner normally specifies certain requirements, that they want certain assets to be delivered on site, or the scale of the development. It can really include anything in that agreement as long as both parties are comfortable with that. And in a case, it will be tailored to the specifics of the project that we're talking about. The three main types of development agreements are, if we call this the standard development agreement, would be where the landowner takes ownership of the land and is responsible for the funding of the scheme and also for sales, but delivers it to the requirements of the landowner. And there's nuances which often we talk about in terms of, for example, build-to-rent or co-living schemes or student accommodation, is forward purchase and forward funding agreements, whereby an agreement is made early on in the project, and either the development is funded as the construction progresses, or there's an agreement in place but payment is made on completion, and then the completed development is transferred to the purchaser. From kind of based on the nature of development agreements, they can be entered at various stages of the project, but it's ideal if they're entered quite early on to make sure that the purchaser or developer has a say in the design and what is being delivered, because then it will cause less delays in terms of any amendments that might be required to the project to meet the purchaser's requirements. Just the last note on this slide, and then we'll move on, is essentially the right delivery route will be determined based on the availability of funding that the landowner has, the expertise required for delivery, and the risk appetite of all the key stakeholders involved in the project. And the first two of these are fairly tangible or kind of easy to establish. Whereas risk appetite, or if you wanted to define it, the tolerance for exposure to markets and financial risk is rather intangible. Now, risk is a very large topic and definitely not one that we'll cover every part of today. We're only going to be scratching the surface of it. And some of you perhaps attended our previous Bitesize broadcast where two of my colleagues, Sam and Emma, and Chris from Martin Arnold dedicated a whole hour to risk management and strategic and project risk. But I won't be doing that today. But I would like to invite you to consider where your organization sits within the spectrum of risk appetite, an example of which is seen on your screens. The table depicts a range from risk-taking all the way through to risk-averse attitudes. And if we had to translate it into the delivery types that I've talked about, then at the most risk-taking end of the spectrum would sit direct delivery, where the developer procures a build contract and takes on the entirety of the development, including all the costs and risk and exposure to market elements. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, we would have perhaps a land sale and works in kind agreement, whereby, for example, the developer is contracted to deliver the proposals, but and the land might be provided by the landowner in return for the return of some affordable housing units at the end of the scheme, or rather at the completion. And joint ventures and development agreements would sit somewhere in between the two, where risk is shared between a number of parties. So establishing where your organization fits on this scale is very important and should be done early on any project. But there's obviously no fixed position for one organization. It can and probably will vary between projects and the priorities. For example, if there's an asset that needs to be delivered in line with your business plan, then probably a more risk-taking approach will be taken as opposed to in a location or on a site which isn't really your key area. So yes, identifying where you sit is key, and it will probably helpful for this is, as Tom mentioned earlier, looking at options appraisals, not just in terms of site-specific considerations, but also in delivery routes, and preparing a business case where you set out your starting position, and then you can test various scenarios and how you react to different risks and how much your organization can tolerate those risks. And just a couple of slides on putting risk in a bit of a wider context. I've included some graphs about the current economic situation and the challenges facing the development sector, along with many other sectors. So obviously, the past couple of years have been rather turbulent, starting from Brexit through to COVID-19, and the still ongoing international conflicts that are impacting the UK's economy, among many other, and put a strain on growth. So much so that the last 2 quarters, based on the British Chamber of Commerce's publication, recorded negative GDP growth that puts the country in a technical recession. And whilst it's not expected to be long-lived, the outlook for economic growth is muted, as you see on kind of the GDP predictions for the next couple of years. Now looking at a bit closer to development, the residential sales market in particular. This is a diagram about the UK's house price change starting from 2022 to current day, or rather February 2024. There's a clear trend that in 2022, the market was quite buoyant. There was often double-digit increases in house prices. And clearly since the beginning of 2023, there's a clear negative trend. And recently we've seen price falls, although the market seems to be stagnating or recovering at the moment. Different commentators are saying different things. Some people are still projecting a dip in 2024. Some of them are more optimistic and say that there'll be a modest increase overall in house prices when we get to the end of the year. There's a very similar graph for London specifically. The only notable thing perhaps is that the dip is bigger, and that probably signals the sensitivity of the market at this higher price point. And I appreciate we're running out of time a bit, but the last slide is on build costs, which have also been increasing in the past couple of years very significantly. Currently, the construction market is, in terms of price increases, has reduced compared to double digits again, like 2 years ago. But still, it's a significant factor in any development project, and it's impacting many parties. And there are a number of contractors that have gone into administration. And I read an article earlier this month from BCIS where it said a shocking number that a total of 4,400 construction firms have been insolvent in the year to February 2023, which is a 37% increase on the same number in 2019, which is quite shocking. So this is the market that we're currently in, and I didn't intend to leave the presentation at such a dire note, but I think to have enough time for questions, I'm gonna stop it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Barbara. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, do pop them into the chat. I've got a few to ask, and we'll have a bit of a discussion here. But yeah, do drop any questions in. To just start off with, Jeremy, as I say, great you've been able to join us and offer that kind of contractor developer perspective. I suppose my question for you, given that we work with clients, a lot of clients on the call, as a contractor developer, what would your advice be to clients in helping to get to a point where we've got a deliverable project, be it retrofit or be it redevelopment?
You talk about in terms of the key considerations.
Yes.
For I would say good clear brief, and you want good experienced people around you that have got good experience, whether it's refurbishment, new build, whether it's a joint venture, whether it's an investment partnership. I would always say pick your partners wisely, and you might have to pay for that, but I always have that thought, you might have to spend £1 to save £10, or spend £1 to get another £10 through the door. As you said earlier, everything is a balance, and it's I would always say pick people you can work with who are like-minded, that you can get on with. So you talked about possibly conflict and argument and avoiding that. You need to work with like-minded people you can get on with, that there will be difficulties along the way, but if it's about how you overcome those. And if you can work with certain organisations where it will become very difficult and it will become more of an issue, you can work with others where there is compromise, and you can then move forward, so you don't waste your energy on discussions or disagreements. And that's what I would do. Work with people, good experienced people who have a good balanced approach.
Excellent. And presumably that is not just on the delivery side, but right through to the consultant team, the design team.
Through, that's from your professional team, particularly around your architect, your engineer, your M&E now, all the way through, right the way through. And particularly at the moment, in terms of contractor insolvencies, as you've just said, it is shocking at the moment, and it is extremely sad as well. But again, it goes back to pick your partners as wisely as possible.
Yeah, and just picking up from a sort of design perspective, are there elements that, again, with your kind of contractor hat on, you spot designs and you're looking at them and think, right, is this an efficient design? What are the factors you're looking for to help things flow as a project?
Quite often, not always, but quite often you will come across designs where you do think, are people spending somebody else's money wisely? So you would say, in terms of a structural solution, we've seen 2-storey, 3-storey buildings designed as an RC frame, whereas a traditional solution for the structure, even if you have introduced steels, cost-wise per square foot or per square metre, it's going to be far more efficient with a traditional than with a concrete frame. So if you're 5 stories, you might want to look at podium with 4 stories of traditional above, so you get your Part A compliance. 6 stories and above, I would always use RC frame. It's quick, it's efficient. From a longevity point of view, it'll perform it's good from a Part B point of view. So that's what I would be doing.
No, that's really helpful. And I think certainly from a working with and for client organisations, actually that challenge sometimes is probably an area we could be stronger at, like the design side, and recognising the implications of
I think
particular direction of travel.
I think you've got to challenge designs. I don't, not everybody knows everything about everything. No one knows everything about everything. Everything is a balance. But as I say, it's sometimes you look at things that don't comply with Part B, things that won't meet regulations. How's it got a planning consent? Again, it goes back to picking your right team, the right level of experience. We spend a lot of time what we call scheme mending in the first 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks. So you'll see air source heat pumps with no enclosures around them. So you're going to have to put an enclosure up there. So then how are you going to prevent falls for people who do the maintenance? So do you have to introduce a parapet? So then you're back to the local authority with, is it an NMA or is it an MMA or is it a full consent? So it's about, again, right people in the right place doing the right job for me.
I like that term, scheme mending. It almost needs to be built into programs.
We always show on the front end of our program 2, 3, 4 weeks what I call compliance checks.
Yeah,
and that is a polite way of saying scheme mending.
No, thank you, Jeremy. Just a question for you, and you set out the different delivery options and mechanisms. In the current perhaps somewhat dire climate you refer to, what's your view on where people are going with those options? What's the trend at the moment?
Yeah. Thank you for raising that. I was actually on my last slide, but I haven't cut that short before that. Yeah, we're certainly seeing because the market is quite difficult and challenging, and obviously there's increased risk coming with increased cost and reducing sales. So risk sharing is a preference for many parties, and joint ventures and all kinds of partnerships are more sought after. And I'm sure Jeremy could talk more about the contractor side, but also contractors building in kind of, or rather instead of going with fixed contracts, kind of building in that flexibility so that they're protected to some extent.
It is an interesting thing though, if you look at that, the pricing of risk, and in the past about what I call race to the bottom, so the lowest price wins. But at the moment, with a number of insolvencies there is, and if you look at the financial and time implications of insolvency, everything is a balance. Cheapest is not always best. So I think we're almost returning as a step or a move towards back to where we were with the Latham report and partnering and more sharing of risks, possibly more in some respect of organisations, as opposed to you've signed the contract, this is it, you deliver. So I think it's becoming more flexible now is what I'm seeing. So what do you think about political will? Because I touched upon it. What is your...
Yeah, and there's a question on the chat as well come up about which is a similar sort of theme in a sense about getting that will, is particularly around if residents live in a building overwhelmingly want to vote for a refurb, but the owner's view it's not financially or environmentally viable. And in the same, I think it's a crossover between that political will. I think it's so important to establish early on in the project that it's got that political support. And I remember relatively early on in my career, I worked on a really exciting project on the face of it, major redevelopment of a sort of central London affordable social housing estate. In my time with Housing Association, and it was a great project, so interesting to be involved with, so interesting from a design perspective, working with the architects. But I think perhaps and going back to your objectives and priorities, and I think as an organisation we were clear that this was an opportunity to deliver a surplus which will help reinvest elsewhere. So there was a clear priority, but I think the challenge was that we didn't get the political will for that and a particular buy-in, and it went on almost too long before really establishing that core question from a political perspective. the concern was it seen actually it's potentially, there was gentrification discussions, it was potentially social housing being taken out of central London and all, which wasn't quite the case, but nonetheless there was that perception, and I think it was possibly a failure to engage early enough and establish that buy-in early on. I think for the question here, mindful of time. So whether it's if residents are voting for a refurb, but the owner's view it's not financially or environmentally viable, you've got to hear what residents are saying, but there's also, it's hard without knowing kind of exactly how viable environmentally it is. You've got to go on a journey, I think, with residents in those situations.
I totally agree. Yes, yeah, it's a difficult balance, isn't it? If we're saying the question about you want a refurb, but it's not viable, but then I think it's about explaining the benefits. So if you're not refurbing, you want to knock down and re-provide, it's why is that the case? What is the reason? What's justification? And if you compared the before and the after picture, so you looked at what are the benefits for you as residents. I think it's what we're just saying. It's early engagement to explain, because you have to. I think we sometimes get lost in the world of building. So we talk about U-value, SAPs, EPCs, financial viability, but then we go and meet people, residents, and you talk about EPCs and SAPs, and it all goes over their head most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. So I think it has to be explained in what I call plain English terms to people about the benefits of, we're not going to refurbish, this is why we're proposing new build, and to try and deliver the message.
Yeah, there's an emotional connection, isn't there? I think we can do on the numbers and the figures and the acronyms, but actually there's an emotional connection of people.
You've lived there for a number of years. Yeah, it might be that your parents live there, relatives have lived there, and you have to be respectful of that as well. This is, we've said this several times. Everything is a balance when you're looking at these schemes.
Yeah. Just mindful, we're kind of at the hour. We could talk, I think, a lot more about a lot of this. But mindful people will need to be sort of getting on to meetings. Our contact details are there. If you would like to follow up with any of this, do please get in touch, and happy to carry on the conversation and any further discussion. In the meantime, we'll let you kind of get back to your busy days. But firstly, thank you, Jeremy, for joining us, taking time out and getting the Bugler view. It's been great. And thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, Barbara.
And thank you once again, all. And
thanks, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.